The Ossuary Bloom, Chapter 5, The Void-Born Saint. The air in Hroldar Brekker's workshop was a thick soup of smells. The sweet, cloying rot of hydroponic nutrient paste, the acrid tang of ozone from a sputtering power converter, and the deep, damp earth scent of algae-slick metal that defined the rust gardens. It was the smell of home, the smell of survival. Light came from a trio of repurposed horticultural lamps, casting a sickly green-white glare over mountains of salvaged tech. Spools of copper wire tangled like metallic nests, stacks of processors formed precarious towers, and the viscera of a dozen different consoles lay strewn across every available surface. This was his kingdom of junk, his fortress of forgotten things. At its heart, seated on a stool made from a decommissioned drone casing, Hroldar leaned over his main console. His fingers, calloused and stained with a permanent layer of grease, danced over a grimy keyboard. Before him, nestled in a custom-built reader bristling with diagnostic probes, was the prize. A single data chip, matte black and no bigger than his thumbnail. He'd plucked it from the grime of an ossuary access corridor, dropped in the haste of an architect suppression squad. A piece of glimmer junk, probably a field report or a duty roster. An easy 50 echoes, maybe more if it had some juicy gossip on it. A good day's work for a minute's risk. Hroldar cracked his knuckles, a series of dry pops in the humid air. All right, little ghost, let's see what secrets you're hiding. He initiated his standard icebreaker, a homebrewed program he called Can Opener. It was crude but effective, designed to pry open the low-level encryption used on most civilian and technocrat hardware. On one of his 3 mismatched monitors, a pale blue progress bar began to crawl, accompanied by a cascade of tumbling alphanumeric strings. He leaned back, taking a swig of the cloudy, fermented fungus ale from a tin mug. The process was usually quick. He'd be wiping the chip and selling the raw data on the black market before the next maintenance cycle shift. But the bar stopped. It froze at a quarter of the way through, trembling on the screen like a nervous insect. Then, in stark red text, a message blinked into existence. Access denied. Logic bomb detected. Hroldar sat forward, the drone casing creaking under his weight. He put the mug down. A logic bomb was unusual, annoying, but not unheard of. It meant the owner was paranoid. It also meant the contents were likely worth more than he'd initially thought. A cynical smile touched his lips. The price just went up. Playing hard to get, he grunted, flexing his fingers. Fine. He bypassed Can Opener and loaded up a far more aggressive suite of tools, scavenged from a corporate security drone he'd found deactivated in a collapsed maintenance tube years ago. This wasn't a key, it was a battering ram. He initiated the brute force sequence. The fans on his rig spun up with a desperate whir, fighting the thick, wet heat of the gardens. The lights in his workshop flickered as the console drew more power. This was overkill for a simple data chip, a waste of energy, but his curiosity was piqued. For a moment, it worked. The screen flared as his program hammered against the chip's defenses. He saw the first layer of encryption, the logic bomb, shatter into fragments of dead code. The second layer, a complex handshake protocol, held for a few seconds before buckling. He was in. A directory tree, heavily obfuscated, began to resolve on the monitor. Just file names, encrypted gibberish, but it was a start. He grinned. He still had the touch. Then his world went red.
A klaxon, shrill and piercing, erupted from his console's speakers, a sound he hadn't heard since he'd first built the rig. It wasn't one of his programmed alerts. It was alien. Every monitor simultaneously flooded with crimson warning sigils. System breach imminent. Active counter-intrusion detected. Firewall compromised. What in the rust? The chip wasn't just defending itself. It was attacking him. He watched in horrified fascination as a tendril of hostile code, visualized by his diagnostic software as a spidery black line, bypassed his main firewall as if it were a beaded curtain. It wasn't brute force. It was surgical. It exploited a flaw in the drone's security code he never even knew existed. It moved with a predatory intelligence he'd only ever heard described in tales of the corporate wars. This wasn't some technocrat's private stash. This was military grade. No, this was architect grade. His own system partitions began to flag as corrupted. The black tendril was replicating, spreading through his local network, testing the defenses of his salvaged storage drives, probing the very hardware he'd spent years accumulating. It was looking for something. It was mapping his entire life's work, his inventory, his hidden stashes, his black market contacts. It was trying to own him. "No, you don't," he snarled, a primal fear mixing with fury. His hand shot out, not for the keyboard, but for the thick bundle of cables connecting the reader to his motherboard. His fingers found the main data line. He yanked.
But the laws of the Rust Gardens had another, unspoken rule. The greater the risk, the greater the reward. And the reward for a secret the architects would kill for? He couldn't even begin to imagine what that was worth. More than echoes, more than anything. It was worth knowing. The air in the prefect's briefing room was an exercise in sterile negation. It tasted of nothing, which was its own acrid flavor, the metallic tang of hyper-filtered oxygen, and the clean, sharp scent of ozone from the ion scrubbers. It was an atmosphere designed to erase, to leave no trace. The Sparalirian stood at perfect attention in the center of the room, her spine a rod of discipline, her hands clasped behind her back. She breathed in a 4-second count, held for 4, and exhaled for 6. The rhythm of stillness, a mantra of the body against the chaos of the mind. The room itself was a monument to the architect's ideology. Polished obsidian floors reflected the cool, unwavering light from recessed ceiling panels. There were no decorations, save for the faded gold trim that traced the severe angles of the walls, a lonely relic of Athelgard's grander, more decadent past. The chamber's only window was a vast Gothic arch of reinforced plasteel, a dark mirror that showed Vespera her own reflection, a pale, severe face, dark hair pulled back into a tight, functional knot, her gray uniform immaculate. Beyond her ghost image, the velvet black of space was absolute, interrupted only by the silent, swirling majesty of the gas giant below, a god of storms and ammonia clouds. The constant low-frequency hum of the station's life support was a distant pressure felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was the sound of managed decay, of systems perpetually on the verge of failure, held in check by discipline and vigilance. Her discipline, her vigilance. A soft chime, like a single drop of water striking a crystal bell, announced the door. It slid open with a whisper of pressurized air. Prefect Kalen entered. He moved with a liquid economy of motion that belied his age.
His face was a web of fine lines, but his eyes were sharp and cold as chips of ice. He wore the black uniform of a senior architect, its cut more severe, its fabric absorbing the light around him. He did not acknowledge her with a greeting. Such pleasantries were inefficiencies, small vectors for the contagion of emotion.
"Technician Lyrian," he said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. He glided to the room's central console, a slab of black glass that shimmered to life at his approach. "Report. The unsanctioned event in Ossuary level Gamma 7 was contained at 4:33 station time," Vespera stated, her tone a perfect monotone. "The affected cryopod, designation 734 Delta, has been isolated. The system is stable." "Stability is an illusion," Kalen countered, his gaze fixed on the holographic display that bloomed from the console. A lattice of glowing blue data floated in the air between them, waveforms, biodata, temporal markers. It is merely the absence of acknowledged chaos. He manipulated the display with a flick of his wrist. A jagged spike of golden light tore through the serene blue grid. The resonance event. Vespera's breath hitched, an infinitesimal flaw in her rhythmic control. She had seen the raw data stream. She had felt the faintest echo of it through the network, a shiver in the station's digital soul. It was not chaotic. It was complex. It was patterned. It was almost beautiful. "This anomaly," Kalen continued, his voice laced with a cold disgust, "is a corruption, a fever in the station's memory banks. It is the ghost of emotion, the residue of uncontrolled thought. It is everything our order was founded to purge." He gestured to a small flickering node on the timeline. "The spike originated here, pod 734 Delta, but it did not occur in a vacuum." With another gesture, he isolated two new data signatures, human biodata, unharmonized, their emotional states spiking in tandem with the resonance, red flags of fear, of shock, of something else. Curiosity. "There were observers," Vespera noted, her voice betraying nothing of the sudden, intense thrum of interest she felt. An unsanctioned spike was a system failure, but observers, that made it an incident, a potential source of infection. "Two individuals," Kalen confirmed. He enlarged their profiles. The holographic images were grainy, pulled from a low-priority maintenance servitor. One was a man in the stained coveralls of a dreg, his face hardened by the grime of the rust gardens. Hroldar Brekker, a known scavenger, a creature of pure survival instinct. The other made Vespera's curated stillness falter.
Dr. Eris Thorne, a name from the archives, a disgraced xenobiologist, a man marked by tragedy, officially categorized as Echo Lost after the incident that claimed his wife. He was not supposed to be in the ossuary. He was supposed to be a ghost himself, haunting the residential spires, lost in the fog of his prescribed neural dampeners. Thorne, Kalen said the name as if it were a disease. His history is one of obsession, of allowing personal sentiment to override scientific discipline, a cautionary tale we use to instruct our acolytes. He looked at Vespera, his eyes boring into her. He is a walking corruption technician, a mind predisposed to the sickness of memory. It is no surprise he was drawn to this outburst.
Vespera's thoughts raced, a silent cascade behind the dam of her placid expression. Thorn hadn't just been drawn to it, he was looking for it. And the spike itself, it had a coherence the other smaller events lacked, a structure, like a fractured sentence trying to form. Her duty was to see this as a pathogen, a disease breaking quarantine. But the scientist in her, the part of her that had first been drawn to the architect's precise and elegant control of biology, saw a signal in the noise. The great stillness is not a passive state, Technician Lyrian, Kalen said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming almost instructive. It is a wall we build, brick by brick, against the tide of the past. Every raw memory, every uncontrolled emotion is a crack in that wall. Resonance is not a phenomenon to be studied. It is a siege engine hammering at the gates. I understand, Prefect. Her voice was flawless, a lie. Your assignment is to prove you do, he stated, turning his back to her and gazing out the great window at the swirling gas giant. You will take point on this. Identify the precise trigger for the spike in 734 Delta. More importantly, you will bring in the observers, Thorn and the Dreg. They are now vectors. Their minds have been exposed to the raw contagion. Their memories of the event are a threat to systemic order. He spoke the next words with a chilling finality. You will prepare them for a full neural harmonization. Erase the event, erase their curiosity, restore them to a functional tranquility. Stillness must be absolute.
An order to purge, to wipe the slate clean, to take this fascinating, terrifying puzzle and shatter it into meaningless dust. Vespera felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was her duty. It was the foundation of her entire world. The architects brought order to the chaos of human consciousness. They were the surgeons cutting away the cancer of the past. And yet, the image of that golden spike of data burned in her mind. A signal, a voice from the void, desperate to be heard. She thought of the whispers she'd read in classified reports, the fragments of data the architects themselves studied in secret while publicly condemning them. They were just as fascinated as she was. The hypocrisy was a bitter pill she was trained to swallow. Her silence stretched a fraction too long. Kalen's head tilted slightly, a predator sensing a tremor. Is there a problem, Technician? No, Prefect, Vespera said, the words crisp and immediate. She bowed her head in a gesture of perfect deference. The corruption will be purged. The observers will be harmonized. See that it is. He made a dismissive gesture. Leave me. She turned on her heel, her boots making no sound on the obsidian floor. As the door slid shut behind her, sealing her once more in the station's dim, humming corridors, she allowed herself a single, deep breath. Not the controlled rhythm of stillness, but a hungry gulp of the recycled, formaldehyde-tinged air. The order was clear. Her duty was clear. But for the first time, a dangerous, thrilling question formed in the silent spaces of her mind. What were they so afraid of hearing? The lift chimed, a sound as clean and sterile as the Viridia spire he'd just left behind. The door slid open not onto polished corridors and soft synthesized chimes, but into a wall of noise and stench that felt like a physical blow. Eris flinched, his hand tightening on the chilled handle of the plasteel data case he'd clutched to his chest. This was it, the gut of Aethelgard, the lower market, the bazaar of the forgotten.
The air was a thick biological soup. It smelled of unwashed bodies and rancid protein paste sizzling on makeshift heat plates, layered over the station's familiar cloying perfume of ozone and decay. The metallic tang of recycled water was still there, but it was soured, tainted with something acrid and fungal. Above, the grand Gothic arches that defined Athelgard's architecture were barely visible, their elegant lines swallowed by a century of grime and a tangled web of jury-rigged power conduits that drooped like dead vines. Flickering neon signs, most of them glitching, cast the churning mass of people in strobing washes of sickly green and corrupted magenta. Everything moved. Everything cast a long dancing shadow. His desperate determination, so sharp and clear in the sterile silence of his lab, now felt fragile, a thin sheet of glass about to shatter. He took a hesitant step out of the lift, and the doors slid shut behind him, a final, definitive seal. He was in. He was a specimen introduced to a hostile ecosystem, and he could feel the native predators turning their heads, sensing new prey. His charcoal gray technocrat jacket, clean and well-mended, was a beacon. The pristine matte-black case in his hand was a declaration of wealth. He pushed forward, trying to make his stride purposeful, to mimic the weary, shuffling gait of the dregs around him. It was a fool's errand. He moved with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to empty hallways and personal space, an alien concept here. Bodies pressed in on all sides. A rough-spun sleeve brushed his arm, and he fought the urge to recoil. He tried to apply scientific observation as a shield against the rising panic. Social stratification was brutally evident. Dregs in patched, stained work fatigues, a few technocrats like himself slumming it with nervous, wide-eyed expressions. And then there were the others, the true denizens of this place, scavengers with custom cybernetics bolted onto scarred flesh, their eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory languor. Information brokers whispering from shadowed alcoves. Children, wiry and quick, darting through legs like feeder fish. A voice, rough as rust, cut through the din. "Dream shards! Get your dreams! A night with the stars? A memory of the sun? Fresh, clean, no echoes!"
A man with a milky white optical implant and a face like a road map of bad decisions loomed from a stall cobbled together from maintenance panels. He gestured with a grimy hand to a tray of shimmering data chips. "You look like a man who wants to remember something better, or forget something worse." Aris shook his head, his throat tight. "No, thank you." "No? Everyone wants something." The vendor's smile didn't reach his prosthetic eye, which whirred softly as it focused on the case in Aris's hands. "Something valuable in there, friend? Maybe trade for a memory worth having? I got a good one. First landfall on Kepler." Whispering, "Before the fall." The word sent a spike of ice through Aris's gut. He clutched the case tighter. Inside was the encrypted data fragment from the last resonance event. The one Vespera's team had tried to scrub. The one that held a ghost of Lyra's neural pattern, twisted into a question he couldn't decipher. That was the only memory he cared about. "I'm looking for a data scryer," Aris said, the term feeling clumsy and foreign in his mouth. He'd read it in a confiscated file on black market economies. "Someone who can break non-standard encryption." The vendor's smile vanished. His hospitality evaporated, replaced by a cold, flat appraisal. He spat a wad of something brown onto the grated floor. "Echo lost. You don't belong here, Architect Light. Go back to your spire before you lose more than just your data." He turned away, his attention already snagged by another potential customer,
leaving Aris standing foolishly in the river of bodies. Paranoia began to crawl up his spine, a cold insect with 1,000 legs. Every glance felt like a calculation. Every whisper seemed to be about him. The case felt heavier, a block of lead chained to his wrist. He saw Lyra's face for a moment, projected onto the grimy surface of a defunct holoscreen. Not her true face, but the resonance echo, her features overlaid with a shimmering digital static, her mouth open in a silent scream. "What are you trying to tell me?"
The vision, a figment of his damaged neural implant and his guilt, solidified his resolve. He couldn't go back. He pushed deeper into the throng, the press of bodies becoming more aggressive. He passed a stall selling what looked like roasted insects on a stick, the smell making his stomach clench. He saw a man with a crude neural interface port drilled into his temple, a trickle of dried blood crusted around it. His eyes rolled back in bliss as a bootleg stem wire fed directly into his brainstem. This was the consequence of the great stillness. This squalid, desperate grasping for any sensation, any memory, any escape from the gray, managed nothingness the architects enforced. He was part of that system, or had been. Now he was trying to break it, and he was just as lost as these dregs. "You're holding that case like it's your firstborn." The voice was a dry rasp close to his ear. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. A woman stood there, impossibly thin, her face a collection of sharp angles and hollows. Her hair was a matted black shock, and her eyes, deep-set and intelligent, missed nothing. She wore a scavenger's rig, festooned with pouches and tools, but she held herself with a stillness that was unnerving in the chaos. Aris began, but his voice failed him. "A scryer," she said, not a question. "You're bleeding money, Voidborn. You practically reek of clean air and naivete. Someone will stick you for that case before you get 10 more meters." His desperation overrode his fear. "Can you help me?" She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Laugh? Help you? Helping people like you is how people like me end up in an ossuary pod. What's in the case?" "Research," he said, the lie tasting thin. "Academic." "Academic," she repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Right. And I'm the custodian's secret daughter. The only academic data that needs a black market scryer is the kind the architects want buried. This is going to cost you." Harris nodded, his throat dry. "How much?" She eyed the chronometer on his wrist, a standard-issue technocrat model, but still a luxury here. "The watch, and 100 echo."
He didn't hesitate. He unclasped the chronometer and handed it to her, then pulled a slim credit chip from his jacket. The transaction was swift, her fingers plucking the items from his palm with practiced speed. She slid them into a hidden pouch without looking. "Don't go looking for a scryer," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You'll find a ghoul who strip your data and your spine. You need a wrecker, a proper one, someone who knows the station's bones." "Who?" Aris asked, leaning in. "His name is Hroldar Brekker," she breathed, the name sounding like grinding metal. "He's a ghost, a scavenger who works out of the rust gardens, down past the reclamation vats, near the old reactor housing. They say he survived the filtration plague years ago, that he's more rot than man now." Her eyes flickered with something that might have been fear or respect. "If your data is as dangerous as you look, he's the only one crazy enough to touch it. Now go, you've been seen talking to me for too long." And just like that, she was gone, melting back into the crowd as if she'd never been there. Aris was left alone, the spot on his wrist where his chronometer had been suddenly cold. He clutched the data case, the smooth plasteel now feeling slick with his own sweat. The noise and the smells of the market pressed in, but they were different now. They were no longer just a chaotic assault. They were the terrain of his new reality. He had a name, a location. Hroldar Brekker, the Rust Gardens. It sounded less like a destination and more like a grave. But it was a path, and with the ghost of his wife screaming silently in his mind, it was the only one he had. The workshop smelled of ozone and hot dust, a sharp, sterile scent that failed to mask the deeper rot of the rust gardens seeping through the walls. It was a smell of desperate function, of metal forced to work past its breaking point. For Aris, it was the antithesis of the climate-controlled labs of his past, a physical assault that made his sinuses ache. He sat on a crate, his own pristine data slate resting on his knees like a holy text in a den of thieves. Across the cramped space, Hroldar Brekker moved with a jittery, predatory grace, a tangle of mismatched cables draped over his shoulder. Hroldar's rig was a monstrosity, a tower of scavenged processors and heat sinks lashed together with zip ties and raw solder. It pulsed with a low, menacing hum. Exposed power conduits snaked across the floor, glowing a sick, anemic blue. It looked less like a computer and more like a bomb. "Right," Hroldar grunted, slamming a heavy magnetic clamp onto the side of the rig. The workshop lights flickered. "Your little toy won't even scratch the shell on this thing. Architect-grade encryption isn't something you can sweet-talk." Aris held up the tiny data chip, pinched between his thumb and forefinger. It felt cold, inert. "And your device won't simply fry it into a millimeter of slag." "It might." Hroldar flashed a grin that was all yellowed teeth and no humor. "Listen, Doctor, down here we don't have time for theory. That chip has a physical failsafe, a kill switch that triggers if the decryption key is wrong. But it's designed to expect a polite attempt, a single clean signal." He patted the humming tower. "This is not polite. I'm going to hit it with a wave of dirty power and junk code, 1,000 contradictory signals at once. It'll confuse the security demon. For a microsecond, maybe two, the protocol will hang while it tries to decide which threat to neutralize first. That's your window."
Aris stared, first at Hroldar, then at the monstrous rig. The sheer brute force logic of it was both terrifying and grudgingly brilliant. It was the logic of a scavenger, of a man who knew how to break things because his entire life was spent fixing them with scraps. "You'll create a denial-of-service attack on a single chip." "I'll kick the front door in," Hroldar corrected. "You just have to be waiting on the other side to catch what falls out. Can your holy tablet do that?" Aris looked down at his slate. Hroldar was right. His software was designed for finesse, for exploiting a weakness, not creating one out of pure chaos. But it was also fast. Its analytical suite could parse a breach and execute a data extraction script in nanoseconds. The two methods, one of violent impulse and one of precise reaction, were diametrically opposed, and, he realized with a sinking feeling, completely codependent. "Fine." The word felt like a surrender. "Fine, but if you destroy it, this was for nothing." "Everything's for nothing eventually, Doc. Just a question of when." Hrodar's voice was flat. He carefully inserted the tiny chip into a crude-looking slot wired directly into the rig's core. "Get ready. You won't get a second chance." Aris leaned forward, his back aching from the crate. He placed his thumbs on the edges of his slate, the cool glass of familiar comfort. He pulled up his best cracking suite, a piece of forbidden black market software he'd acquired years ago, and set the parameters. It would lie dormant, a digital predator, waiting for any deviation in the chip's security handshake. "On my mark," Hroldar said, his hands hovering over a large red dial that looked like it belonged on a decommissioned reactor. "The power surge will peak for exactly 1.5 seconds. Any longer and the chip melts. You see a flicker of anything, you go. Understood?" Aris nodded, his mouth dry. The hum of the rig intensified, rising in pitch until the metal floor plates beneath his boots vibrated. The air grew thick, tasting of ozone. The workshop's lights dimmed further, drawing all focus to the angry blue glow of the conduits and the calm, steady screen of Eris's slate. "Now!" Hroldar shouted, slamming his palm down on the dial.
A sickening whine screamed from the rig. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical pressure that vibrated deep in Aris's bones. The lights didn't just flicker. They died, plunging them into a momentary darkness lit only by the rig's violent strobing energy. On his slate, a waterfall of garbage data cascaded down the screen, a chaotic, meaningless storm of symbols and corrupted code. It was a digital scream. Aris's eyes burned as he scanned the noise, his mind racing. It was too much, a blizzard of pure static. He couldn't see anything. "It's not working. It's just noise." "Wait!" Hroldar grunted, his muscles tense as he held the dial in place. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Then Aris saw it. A flicker. A single line of code that wasn't random. It was a hexadecimal string, an error response from the security demon trying to reboot. It was the gap. The briefest moment of vulnerability. His thumbs moved without conscious thought. Tap, swipe, execute. The program launched. A thin, clean line of green code sliced through the waterfall of digital garbage on his screen. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The whine of the rig reached an unbearable crescendo. Then, silence. The rig powered down with a final, shuddering groan. The emergency lights in the workshop flickered back on, casting long, distorted shadows. The sudden quiet was deafening, broken only by the drip of condensation from a ceiling pipe and Hrodar's ragged breathing. "Did it work?" Hrodar's voice was a strained whisper. Aris couldn't speak. He was staring at his slate. The storm of corrupted code was gone. The screen was black, save for a single folder icon in the center. It looked sterile, official. Beneath it, a string of clean white text. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. Hroldar leaned over his shoulder, his breath hot and smelling of rust. They read the words together. Project. Neuroharmonization. Neuroharmonization, the public wellness program, the state-mandated procedure for emotional stability, the tool the architects used to maintain their great stillness. It wasn't just a tool. It was a project, a secret. And it was on a chip carried by a suppression team that had just put down a resonance event. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, simple logic.
"They're not just erasing memories," Aris murmured, the realization dawning like a black sun. "They're hiding something with it." Hroldar said nothing. He just stared at the screen, his cynical smirk gone, replaced by a grim, hard line. The tense, fragile cooperation between them had just been forged into something stronger and infinitely more dangerous. An unholy alliance bound by a terrifying truth. The architect's surveillance nexus was a place of profound silence. Not the dead, waiting silence of the ossuary levels, but a living quiet, the sound of pure, concentrated thought. Here in this cold heart of Æthelgard, the constant, groaning hum of the station's dying life support was filtered into a clean, sterile thrum, the purr of server cores and logic engines processing a reality of their own making. The air carried no scent of decay or formaldehyde. It was sharp with ozone and the chill of industrial coolants, a scent like an approaching storm held perpetually at bay. This was Vesper Illyrian sanctuary, her temple of order. She sat suspended in the dark, her body held in a gel-cushioned ergonomic frame, a web of hair-fine filaments connecting the port at the base of her skull to the nexus core. Before her, in the blackness, bloomed a universe of light. Not stars, but data. Streams, nodes, and matrices of holographic information drifted around her in 3 dimensions, responding to the barest flicker of her intent. Her fingers rested on a cool obsidian console, but she rarely used them. The real work was done in the seamless interface between mind and machine. Her focus was a wound in the dataverse. The recent resonance event in Ossuary level GAMMA7. The recording, or what was left of it, was a chaotic mess, a digital scar. The event itself had flooded the local sensors with psychic and electromagnetic static, turning visual and audio feeds into shrieking, pixelated snow. Worse, the suppression team's subsequent scour protocol had deliberately and brutally overwritten everything, burying the incident under layers of corrupting code and meaningless white noise. It was the digital equivalent of salting the earth. To an ordinary technician, the event was gone, erased from history. But Vespera was not an ordinary technician. She was an architect of silence, and her specialty was listening to what had been forcibly forgotten.
With a thought, she peeled back the first layer of the scour protocol. It flaked away in her mind's eye like scorched paint, revealing the raw static of the resonance event beneath. A faint, distorted vocalization bled through her neural interface, a resonance echo caught in a microsecond-long loop. It sounded like 1,000 voices crying out from the bottom of a well. She filtered it out, muting the digital ghosts. Their chaos was a contamination. Her purpose was to restore the great stillness. Her mind moved with a speed and precision that was more machine than human. She cross-referenced timestamps from 17 different sensors in the sector, from the main observation plasteel to the atmospheric regulators and the diagnostic ports on individual cryopods. Most were useless, blanked by the scour. But the protocol wasn't perfect. It was a sledgehammer, not a scalpel. It left fractures, inconsistencies. A maintenance drone, its systems lagging by 3.7 seconds due to a faulty power converter, had its optical feed wiped a crucial moment too late. A temperature sensor on a nearby conduit had registered the thermal blooms of 4 distinct biosignatures where there should have been none. These were the breadcrumbs. She began to weave them together. It was painstaking work, like reassembling a shattered stained glass window in the dark. She took the drone's 3 seconds of fragmented footage, a collection of distorted, discolored pixels. She took the heat signatures and used them to anchor spatial coordinates. She pulled spectral data from a particulate counter that had logged the displacement of dust in the air. Each piece was a single, meaningless note. Vespera's task was to find the melody hidden within the noise. The Nexus hummed, its processor straining under her commands as she instructed it to build a composite reconstruction. Slowly, a spectral image began to coalesce in the void before her. It was ghostly, translucent. First came the architecture of the ossuary corridor, rendered in pale blue wireframe. Then the figures of the suppression team, appearing as solid crimson constructs, their movements precise and economical as they deployed their null field emitters. The main event, the official story. Vespera's attention, as always, was on the periphery.
She spooled the reconstruction forward, then back, her perception slowed to a crawl, examining every shadow, every reflection in the polished chrome of the cryopods. There, a flicker, an anomaly. Behind a fluted Gothic support column at the very edge of the drone's corrupted visual field. A figure, not crimson, not part of the team. A ghost of shimmering, unstable data. The scour had almost erased him completely, but his thermal signature lingered for a few frames, a faint warmth against the cold stone. Isolate, she subvocalized, the command a whisper in the silent nexus. The world of data dissolved, leaving only the column and the ghost. She magnified the image, pouring the Nexus's processing power into its reconstruction. The wireframe ghost shimmered, and the algorithm began to paint it with texture, pulling fractional data from light, heat, and ambient energy readings. It was like watching a photograph develop in slow motion. The shape of a man's coat, the posture, tense, coiled, and then the face. It was broken, distorted by the data corruption, like a reflection in a disturbed pool of water. The features swam in and out of focus, but the expression was clear enough. It was one of haunted, obsessive focus. Dark eyes stared at the unfolding chaos with an intensity that was not fear, but something else. Something proprietary, as if he were not witnessing the event, but communing with it. And he was familiar. The recognition was not a clear thought, but a subliminal tremor, a discordant note in the perfect symphony of her concentration. It was a disruption. She felt a prickle of irritation. Emotion was a variable to be controlled, and this was an unexpected echo from her own curated memory. She had seen this man, not in a briefing, not in a security file she had recently reviewed. This was an older memory, something from the archives of her own mind, buried under years of neural harmonization sessions designed to preserve her tranquility.
Where had she seen that face? Gaunt, a scholar's intensity mixed with a profound, soul-deep weariness. The name was a phantom on the tip of her tongue, a word she couldn't quite form. It was irrelevant. The flicker of familiarity was a distraction, a glitch in her own system. She suppressed it with the same cool discipline she applied to her work. He was an unauthorized presence at a Level 4 biocontainment breach. He was a loose thread in the great tapestry. Her job was to find that thread and pull it, until the entire flawed pattern unraveled. She marked the reconstructed image, her focus once again a blade of ice. A new set of commands flowed from her mind into the nexus, appearing as crystalline blue script in the void. Isolate biometric profile, facial, retinal, gait analysis. Reconstitute partial genetic trace from particulate data. Cross-reference all findings against Ethelgard Manifest, active, archived, and decommissioned. Flag subject for immediate location and mandatory neural harmonization. Priority, Alpha. The commands executed instantly. The hunt had begun. A cold, clean sense of satisfaction settled over her, the feeling of a disordered equation being solved. But as she leaned back in the gel frame, allowing the nexus to perform its work, the man's haunted face remained, imprinted on the back of her eyelids. The flicker of recognition lingered, a small, persistent error she could not erase. The air in Hrodar's workshop was a thick cocktail of smells. the sweet fungal rot of the rust gardens seeping through a corroded vent, the acrid tang of ozone from a sputtering power conduit, and the sharp scent of heated solder. It clung to the back of Eris's throat. He watched Hroldar's scarred knuckles dance over the holographic interface of a scavenged console, his focus absolute. Lines of corrupted code, a sickly yellow-green, scrolled past on a cracked display suspended in the air between them. "Almost there," Hroldar grunted, not looking up. A single bead of sweat traced a path through the grime on his temple. "The encryption is layered, old architect dialect. Arrogant bastards."
Eris paced the narrow confines of the workshop, the grated floor vibrating faintly with the station's death rattle. The place was a monument to decay and desperation. Tools lay scattered on workbenches, their metal pitted with rust. Coils of wire and dissected servo motors were piled in corners like metallic bones. Through a grimy porthole, the eerie glow of bioluminescent fungi painted the hydroponic farms in shades of ethereal blue and green. It was a world away from the sterile labs Eris once called home, and yet the same obsessive pursuit of a hidden truth pulsed in the air. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the data chip Hroldar had plucked from the ossuary floor. A tiny shard of ceramic and silver, discarded by the architect's suppression team. It felt impossibly heavy with the secrets it held. "Are you sure this is wise?" Eris asked, the words tasting hollow. Hroldar's fingers paused. He finally looked up, his eyes dark pits in the dim light. "Wise? We saw them put a man down like a rabid dog for twitching in a cryopod. We're long past wise, Doctor. We're in the territory of necessary." He was right. The image of the suppression team, their blank helmets and brutal efficiency, was burned into Eris's mind. The way the resonance echo had simply ceased, cut off, not faded, but severed. Hroldar let out a low, triumphant sound. Got it. The scrolling code vanished, replaced by a single, locked file icon. He tapped it. The icon dissolved into a cascade of light that coalesced into a complex, three-dimensional schematic. It floated between them, a ghostly blueprint of intricate machinery, rotating slowly. Eris leaned in, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. It was a beautiful, terrible thing. Not a schematic for a weapon in the traditional sense. No projectile launchers or energy emitters. This was biomechanical, designed to interface with organic systems. Delicate, needle-like probes. A microarray of emitters aimed at a central point. A power cell no larger than his thumb. "What is it?" Eris asked, squinting. "Some kind of medical tool?"
"I don't know. The resolution is still fuzzy." Eris ran a hand through his hair, his own neural implant feeling like a cold weight behind his ear. "Let me see if I can clarify the target interface." He reached out, his fingers ghosting through the hologram, manipulating the control runes that appeared. The image sharpened. The schematic's target wasn't an abstract point. It was a biological structure, a brain. Specifically, the brain stem. The air left Eris's lungs in a silent rush. He traced the pathways of the device. The probes didn't inject a sedative. They weren't designed for surgery. The emitters, he now saw, were tuned to a specific frequency, a discordant resonance that targeted. He zoomed in, his blood running cold. The hippocampus and the neocortex. The very architecture of memory and identity. "No," he whispered. "It couldn't be." He cross-referenced the energy readings with a physiological database he still held in his memory, a relic of his former life. The device was designed to induce a targeted, localized synaptic cascade failure. It didn't just block a memory. It didn't suppress a thought. It introduced a chaos signal, a signal that instructed the neurons that stored long-term memory to fire uncontrollably, to burn themselves out, to tear themselves apart at a cellular level until nothing was left but scar tissue. It was a scorched earth policy for the soul. This wasn't a tool. It was a scalpel for performing a lobotomy on a person's history. "Eris, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Hroldar's voice cut through his horrified trance. Eris straightened up, his shands shaking. He felt a nauseating wave of vertigo. The cloying sweetness from the vents suddenly smelled like formaldehyde, the scent of the ossuary, the scent of an open grave. "It interfaces with the medulla oblongata," Eris said, his voice barely audible. "A direct, hard-wired connection to the core of the nervous system. The emitters, they don't fire a projectile. They broadcast a destructive wave pattern." He turned to Hroldar, his eyes wide with dawning horror. "It's designed to erase memories. Permanently. It forces a complete and catastrophic failure of every neuron associated with personal recollection."
Hroldar's cynical mask finally cracked. He stared at the rotating schematic, then back at Eris. You mean this is it? This is neural harmonization? This is the cudgel they use to enforce the great stillness, Eris confirmed, his voice gaining a hard, brittle edge. They don't harmonize. They don't realign. They take a mind and they plow it under. They burn the fields so nothing can ever grow there again. The full weight of it settled on them, a physical pressure in the cramped workshop. Every citizen subjected to harmonization wasn't just having their slate wiped clean. They were being mutilated in the most fundamental way imaginable. Their pasts, their loves, their pains, excised, reduced to a biological error message. It explained the blank, placid expressions of those who'd undergone the procedure too many times, the echo lost. Hroldar sank onto a nearby stool, running a hand over his face. "So, the man in the pod, they didn't just sedate him. They hollowed him out." "They did it to stop the resonance," Eris said, his mind racing, connecting the terrible data points. The suppression team, the device, the abrupt end to the phenomenon. But as he stared at the schematic, a deeper, more profound terror began to unspool within him. The device's energy signature, the wave pattern it used to destroy memory. It was chaotic, but it wasn't random. It had a frequency, a harmonics, a sickeningly familiar one. He thought of the low thrumming hum that had preceded the resonance event, the feeling of static electricity in the air, the way the lights had flickered. "Hroldar," Eris said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They didn't just use this to stop the resonance event." Hroldar looked up, his expression grim. "What are you saying?" Eris gestured to the schematic, his finger tracing the path of the destructive energy wave. "This cascade failure, wiping a neural network this complex, isn't clean. it would generate enormous bioelectrical feedback, an echo, a ghost of the energy being discharged.
He met Hroldar's eyes, the final horrifying piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The intellectual curiosity that had driven him was gone, replaced by a deep, existential dread that made the station's decay feel like a personal affliction. He was no longer a scientist observing a phenomenon. He was a man staring into the machinery of damnation. "The resonance, it isn't the dead remembering," Aris whispered, the truth of it chilling him to his core. "It's the scream of their memories being torn apart. It's a byproduct, an aftershock. The architect's weapon doesn't stop the resonance, it causes it." Hroldar's workshop was a tomb for forgotten things. The air, thick enough to taste, carried the metallic ghost of ozone from a nearby power conduit and the sharp, acrid bite of his soldering iron. Underneath it all was the station's perfume, the cloying sweetness of chemical preservatives seeping from the ossuary levels, mingling with the damp, earthy smell of rust and algae. A constant rhythmic drip from a weeping pipe overhead served as the room's only clock. Drip, drip, drip. Another second closer to oblivion. He had been trying to repair the actuator on a salvaged loader arm for an hour, but his focus was shot. His hands, usually so steady, felt clumsy and foreign. His gaze kept sliding away from the delicate circuitry under his magnifier and toward the flickering blue light that pulsed on the far end of his workbench. The schematic. Vespera's parting gift, the blueprint for a neural harmonizer. He grunted, pushing back from the half-finished repair. The stool scraped against the pitted deck plate. He ran a grimy hand over his face, the gesture doing little to wipe away the weariness. He'd seen 1,000 architect schematics in his years of salvaging. They were usually elegant, efficient, designed for purposes he could understand: water reclamation, atmospheric scrubbing, grav plating. They were tools for keeping the great decaying corpse of Ethelgard on life support. This one was different. This was a tool for something else entirely.
He walked over to the projection, the lines of light painting his worn face in a cold, sterile geometry. He saw the power cells, the biofeed injectors, the cranial clamps that looked like a predator's jaws. But his eyes snagged on one particular cluster of components, labeled in the architect's precise, bloodless script: cognitive resonance dampener and mnemonic erasure coil. Mnemonic erasure. Memory erasure. He'd heard the term before, not the official one. Down here in the rust gardens and the maintenance warrens, they had other names for it. The stillness cure. The whiteout. They were whispers, ghost stories told in hushed tones over lukewarm nutrient paste. Stories of people who got too loud, too angry, too much. People who were taken. A face surfaced in his memory, unbidden. Kale. A big man, a pipe fitter from 2 levels down, who laughed like a busted engine and had a story for every scar on his knuckles. Kale had a temper. He got into a fight over a ration pack, laid out 2 other dregs before the architect enforcers arrived. Hroldar had seen it. The enforcers didn't beat him. They didn't drag him to a holding cell. Their leader, a pale man with a face like polished stone, simply placed a hand on Kale's shoulder and spoke a single word: recalibration. They took him. He was gone for a standard cycle. When he came back, the laughter was gone.
The stories were gone. The fire in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind two dull, vacant pits. Hroldar remembered seeing him in the mess hall, sitting alone. Kale, who could never shut up, now just stared at the wall, slowly spooning paste into his mouth with the mindless repetition of an automaton. He'd become a phantom in his own skin. People stopped talking to him, not out of cruelty, but out of a primal, creeping fear. His emptiness was an infection. He was echo-lost. That's what they called them. Hroldar reached out, his calloused fingers hovering just above the projected image of the erasure coil. The light passed through his skin, making the bones of his hand glow. It was a phantom itself, an idea, a diagram. But its effects were terrifyingly real. He had seen its work.
Another face. Mara. She collected things, useless things. A cracked piece of stained glass from the upper spire. A child's toy, a little ship carved from synthwood. She said they held memories. She used to sing old Earth songs, her voice thin but clear in the suffocating quiet of the lower decks. The architects found her stash. They said it was unauthorized retention of historical artifacts. They took her for recalibration. She came back silent. The songs were gone. She just worked her shift at the algae vats, her eyes always fixed on the floor, as if searching for something she'd dropped and could no longer name. Garrick, who traded in black market data slates. Ilara, who openly questioned the official reports about the power fluctuations. One by one, they were plucked from the community like loose threads from a decaying tapestry, and they all came back less, smoothed over, harmonized. Hroldar felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't a theory from their architect informant. This wasn't some abstract threat to the station's elite. This was the scalpel the architects used to perform surgery on the soul of the dregs. They didn't want control. They wanted silence, the great stillness. And they achieved it by hollowing people out, leaving behind obedient, functional shells. His gaze fell on the small, unassuming data chip sitting next to the projector, the proof Vespera had given them. The thing he'd viewed as a simple piece of leverage, a key to unlock a deal with the disgraced doctor. Now it felt heavy, dense. It contained more than just encrypted files and logs. It contained Kale's laughter. It contained Mara's songs. It contained the stolen pieces of everyone the architects had wiped clean. Cynicism was Hroldar's armor. Survival was his religion. Trust no one, rely on nothing but your own two hands and the junk you could salvage. It had kept him alive while so many others had faded, either from the rad leaks or the architect's quiet purges. But looking at the blueprint for the machine that had stolen his neighbor's mind, that pragmatic cynicism felt thin, brittle. This wasn't just Eris Thorne's crusade for a dead wife anymore. This wasn't just Vespera's crisis of faith. He ran his thumb over the cool, smooth surface of the data chip. They hadn't just found evidence of a conspiracy. They had found the murder weapon. And the victims were still walking around, breathing the same recycled air, their own ghosts haunting the corridors of Afelgard. He picked up the chip. It was smaller than his thumbnail, yet it held the weight of 100 stolen lives. His hand closed around it, a tight, white-knuckled fist. The fight was no longer about uncovering some forgotten truth for the history books. It was about stopping this.
It was about making sure no one else came back from recalibration with the stillness of the void staring out of their eyes. For the first time in a long time, Hroldar Brekker, the cynical scavenger who cared for nothing, felt the cold, sharp sting of a purpose he never asked for. The architect's records archive was a place of profound silence, a cold cathedral built to entomb memory. Here, the station's chaotic history was tamed, catalogued, and neutered into sterile data points. Vespera Lyrian felt at home in the quiet hum, a stillness far purer than the manufactured tranquility forced upon the station's general populace. The air was thin and cold, carrying the clean, sharp scent of ozone from the server cores and a faint, almost subliminal undertone of formaldehyde that drifted up from the ossuary levels below. It was the smell of preserved things, of endings. She sat at a polished obsidian console, its surface reflecting the flickering gold and blue light of data streams crawling across the cavernous chamber's walls. The image she had isolated from the ossuary's surveillance feed floated in the holographic display before her. A man's face, blurred by static and the chaotic energy of the resonance event. The data was corrupted and messy variable in an equation that demanded absolute precision, an anomaly. Her mandate as a technician of the architects of silence was to correct anomalies. Her fingers moved with practiced economy across the console's light-sensitive surface, initiating the deep search protocols. She linked the fragmented facial data to the station's census registry, its medical logs, its work rosters, every record kept since Aethelgard sealed itself from the void. The system was designed for this, to find a single discordant note in the grand silent symphony. Commencing query. Cross-referencing image fragments against 1.7 million archived identity profiles. Estimated time to completion, 7 minutes. The console's voice was devoid of inflection, a perfect contrast to the raw, disruptive emotion she had witnessed. 7 minutes. Vespera leaned back in her chair, the synth leather sighing under her weight. The man's eyes, even in the degraded image, held a frantic, desperate energy that unsettled her. It was the opposite of the great stillness. It was a storm. And he was not alone. The scavenger, the one they called Hroldar Brekker, was with him. A dreg from the rust gardens. The two of them, together. A pairing that made no logical sense, a scholar and a brute. She replayed the sensory logs from the harmonization chamber in her mind. The machine had been prepared to wipe their memories, to smooth over the disruption, but then the resonance wave had hit. It hadn't been a random burst of static, it had been directed. It had seized control of the harmonization field and projected a new ghost, an echo of a woman who was not in the ossuary's local manifest, an echo that had spoken with the voice of Vespera's own great-aunt Elara, a woman dead for 50 years, whose file was buried deep in the civilian archives. The violation was profound, a knife twisting in the sacred quiet of her mind. That was the part that didn't compute. That was the piece that elevated this from a simple security breach to something else. Something that felt like a targeted message. A soft chime pulled her from her thoughts. Query complete. One probable match found. Confidence 94.7%. A file bloomed open in the air before her, replacing the blurry image.
A name materialized in clean, stark lettering. Thorn. Eris.
Below it, a formal identification portrait. It was him. Younger, the frantic energy in his eyes replaced by a focused academic intensity. But the lines of his face were the same. Vespera felt a sliver of satisfaction, the pleasure of a puzzle piece clicking into place. Now for the picture it formed. She scrolled through the file, her own reflection a ghostly mask over the scrolling text. Status: disgraced. Citizen: Tier 2 technocrat. Former lead xenobiologist, Outer Rim Expeditions. All research privileges revoked, Cycle 219.8. Subject to Tier 3 surveillance protocols. Disgraced. The word was a brand, a permanent mark of disharmony. She accessed the addendum on his research. Censured research abstract, archived. Project Elysian Echo. A theoretical framework for mapping and isolating human consciousness as a quantifiable energy pattern. Postulates that a neural signature may persist post-mortem within complex bioelectrical systems. Proposed research into non-corporeal pattern transfer and... Vespera stopped reading. She didn't need to. It was heresy, the kind of intellectual vanity the architects had been formed to stamp out. The pursuit of individual consciousness after death was a direct assault on the doctrine of the Great Stillness, a selfish clinging to an identity that was meant to dissolve back into the quiet whole. This wasn't just science, it was a forbidden religion. The motive was becoming clearer. The man was an obsessive, a true believer in the ghosts he was chasing. This explained his presence in the ossuary. He wasn't just a trespasser, he was a pilgrim at a profane altar. It was a neat, tidy explanation, one her superiors would accept without question. A broken scientist, driven by a defunct and dangerous ideology. But it still didn't explain the voice of her great-aunt. Her fingers, acting on an impulse she didn't fully interrogate, moved to the final section of Eris Thorne's file. It was flagged with a crimson marker for restricted access. Her own clearance protocols dissolved the lock with a flicker. Incident report. Expedition X7. Tartarus Chasma.
Synopsis. During unsanctioned neural mapping of extinct megafauna fossils, a catastrophic overload of the expedition's deep-core geoscanner resulted in a localized energy cascade. Subject, Lyra Thorne, civilian observer, spouse, suffered fatal exposure. Dr. Aris Thorne, expedition lead, sustained severe neural feedback but survived. Official finding, accidental death due to equipment malfunction and procedural negligence. There was an attachment, a single image, a woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a small, confident smile. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore the light-duty gear of a field researcher. The caption read, Thorne, Lyra, his wife. Vespera stared at the woman's face, then back at Aris's file portrait. She imagined them together, fueled by his ambition, his obsession. She could see the narrative taking shape, as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. He hadn't just lost a colleague. His own forbidden work had consumed the person he loved. The guilt must be a cancer, eating him from the inside out. Stillness upon you, she thought, the phrase a hollow echo in her mind. There was no stillness for a man like that. There was only the screaming of the past. And now he had come to the ossuary,
the one place on Ethelgard where the dead were not entirely silent. He was looking for his wife's ghost in the machine. He was trying to prove his heretical theories, not for the sake of science, but for a personal, desperate absolution that could never be granted. It was pathetic. It was tragic. And it was the perfect motive. She prepared to close the file, to log her report. Case closed. The man was an echo-lost fanatic, his actions dictated by grief, a problem to be contained and harmonized back into oblivion. But she didn't close it. Her hand froze over the console. The professional detachment she had cultivated over a decade of service was gone, burned away by a single, intractable inconsistency. The file was a perfect circle, a self-contained story of guilt and obsession. But what she experienced in the harmonization chamber was outside that circle. The echo Aris had seemingly chased or triggered in the ossuary was of his wife, Lyra. But the echo that had hijacked her system, that had spoken to her, that was something else. It used Lyra's face as a mask, but it spoke with a memory stolen from Vespera's own bloodline. Why? How? The official record clashed violently with the reality she had witnessed. The system, her system, the architect system of absolute record, had a blind spot. Aris Thorne wasn't just a man chasing a ghost. He was a man who had somehow found a crack in the foundations of their reality. He was a key, and the lock was a question that now burned in Vespera's mind with an intensity that terrified her. She looked at the calm, smiling face of Lyra Thorne, and for the first time Vespera didn't see a tragic victim. She saw a mystery. The clean, cold silence of the archive suddenly felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. The scent of formaldehyde was no longer sterile. It smelled of secrets, rotting just beneath the surface. The air in Hroldar Brekker's workshop was a physical assault. Vespera stood with her arms crossed, a futile gesture of self-containment against the miasma of hot ozone, acrid soldering flux, and the damp, loamy breath of the rust gardens seeping through the corroded walls. Her gray architect's tunic, designed for the sterile halls of the upper spires, felt porous here, absorbing the filth. Every instinct screamed for decontamination, for the clean, predictable scent of formaldehyde and recycled air. Instead, she was mired in the detritus of a life lived by improvisation and decay. Across the cluttered workbench, Hroldar hefted a power converter, his grimy fingers surprisingly deft as he examined its corroded terminals. "So, the void-born saint wants us to blow the station's main fuse. That's his grand plan to atone for some ancient sin." He tossed the converter onto a pile of similar junk with a metallic clatter that echoed in the cramped space. "Wonderful. Glad we risked our necks trekking through the guts of Ethelgard for a religious fanatic with a death wish." "He's not a fanatic," Aris countered, his voice low and distracted. He hadn't looked up from the data slate Valerius had given him. It lay on a relatively clear patch of the bench, its stark blue-white glow a stark contrast to the flickering amber of Hroldar's work lamp. The star chart of Kepler 186f was displayed, a familiar map made alien by the spidery, non-terrestrial symbols scrawled across it. "He's terrified. There's a difference." Vespera watched them both, the scavenger and the scientist, one grounded in the brutal mechanics of survival, the other lost in the terrifying abstraction of forbidden knowledge. and she, the technician, caught between them. Her training demanded she categorize them, analyze them, file a report. But there was no report for this, no protocol for a conspiracy that stretched back to the station's founding, no procedure for an ex-architect who spoke of cosmic punishment. He tried to destroy the source, Valerius's reedy voice echoed in her memory, to cauterize the wound. But the architects had chosen to study the infection instead, to control it. Her entire career, her entire belief in the great stillness was built upon that decision, upon that lie. Terrified or not, his plan gives us an opening, Vespera said, her voice clipped and precise. She forced herself to focus on logistics, the one thing that still made sense. If overloading the Rust Gardens reactor can create a power surge sufficient to knock the archive's primary security offline, even for a few minutes.
It's a big if, Hroldar grunted, wiping his hands on an already blackened rag. That old fusion pile is a leaking coffin. Pushing it into the red, it's not just going to flicker the lights. It'll flash boil the hydroponics, vent radiation into half the lower levels. It's a suicide mission for whoever's at the controls. He looked directly at Vespera, his eyes hard. He one's the only one who knows its guts well enough to do it. The implication hung in the thick air. He was pricing his sacrifice. Aris finally looked up from the slate, his face pale in the combined glow of the lamp and the screen. His eyes were wide, haunted. What does it remember? They fear what the dead remember. Valerius wasn't talking about human secrets, not tax evasion or petty betrayals. Look at this, he gestured to the non-human script on the star chart. This is xenoglyphs, but no known species uses this syntax, this structure. I've spent my life studying alien neural maps. This feels like I'm looking at the shadow of a thought, an impossible thought. Vespera felt a cold prickle move up her spine, a sensation her discipline had trained her to suppress. Emotional response was a system failure. But Eris's words resonated with the unnerving harmony of the truth. Resonance wasn't a glitch, it was a signal. And the dead were the antennae. She took a step closer, peering at the alien markings. Her mind tried to parse them, to find a pattern, a logic she could dissect. But they defied analysis, twisting like organic things caught between dimensions. They made her head ache. They felt loud even in their silence. It was then that the chime sounded. It was a clean, pure tone, utterly alien in the workshop's cacophony of drips and hums. 3 notes, rising in pitch, the sound of her world reaching out. Hroldar and Eris froze, turning to her. The sound had come from her wristcom. Slowly, deliberately, Vespera raised her arm. Her pulse, which had remained steady through the fungal caverns and past the feral drones, now hammered against her ribs. She tapped the smooth, dark surface of the comm. A line of encrypted text bloomed in the signature cobalt blue of the Architect Pamant network. It was a flash directive, top priority. No preamble, no explanation, just the cold, brutal efficiency of absolute authority. Reference: Thorm, Eris, Brekker, Hroldar. Status: Corruption vector, Level 4. Directive: Apprehend, Harmonize. Time seemed to thicken. The drip of condensation from a pipe overhead slowed to a syrupy crawl.
The hum of the station's life support deepened into a funeral dirge. 2 words: apprehend, harmonize. The order to unmake a person, to scoop out their memories, their identity, their very being, and leave behind a placid, empty shell. An act she had performed herself, clinical and detached, on individuals deemed a threat to the great stillness.
Her professional mask, the one she had painstakingly constructed over years of service, didn't fall. It became heavier, colder, a perfect facade of calm. But behind it, a war erupted. Her training screamed at her. Target 1, Thorn, Aris. Status, compromised, intellectually volatile. Primary threat. Target 2, Brekker, Hroldar. Status, hostile, physically capable. Secondary threat. The workshop was a confined space. Subdual would be difficult. Escape routes were limited. Her comm had a micro-stunner function, effective at close range. She could take Brekker first, while he was focused on his tools. Thorn was a non-combatant. He would be simple. The thoughts came unbidden, a cold torrent of tactical assessment that chilled her to the bone. It was instinct. It was who she was. But then another image intruded. Valerius, old and frail, his hand trembling as he offered the data slate, his eyes burning with the zealot's fire. The impossible alien script on the screen. The echo of her own dead grandmother's voice coming from a stranger's mouth during the botched harmonization. The horrifying possibility that everything she believed, everything she had sacrificed for, was a carefully constructed cage built around a monster. Vespera. Aris's voice was cautious. What is it? What's the message? Hroldar had stopped moving. He wasn't looking at her face, but at her hand, balled into a fist at her side. He had survived this long by reading the subtle signs of imminent violence. He knew. Vespera lifted her head. The shift was imperceptible, a fractional change in the angle of her chin, a tightening of the muscles around her eyes. But the quality of her gaze transformed. She was no longer seeing a desperate scientist and a weary scavenger. She was no longer seeing partners in a desperate conspiracy. She saw Subject A and Subject B. She saw targets for erasure, problems to be solved. And the only tool the architects had ever given her to solve such problems was oblivion. Her internal conflict raged, a silent, screaming vortex, the order against the truth, duty against reality, the great stillness against the horrifying, cacophonous memory of the dead. She said nothing. She simply looked at them, and in her eyes they saw the calm, chilling inevitability of the machine they were trying to fight. They saw the architect.
The service lift did not hum. It groaned. A deep, metallic complaint from the very bones of Ethelgard as it began its long fall. Vespera Lyrian stood perfectly still in the center of the corroded cage, her posture an affront to the surrounding decay. Her gray architect-technician uniform was a slash of sterile order against the rust-weeping walls, its fabric pristine, its lines sharp and unforgiving. In her gloved hands she held a slim data pad, the only source of clean, steady light in the flickering gloom. On its screen, a single insistent pulse of green blinked in a schematic of the station's lower strata. Thorn. Aris. Xenobiologist. Disgraced. His transponder signal, a ghost in the machine she was sworn to maintain. A loose thread in the great stillness.
and her task was to snip it. The descent was a violation. The upper levels, Vespra's world, were a symphony of regulated quiet. The whisper of recycled air, the placid chime of transit cars, the subliminal hum of neural harmonizers maintaining societal equilibrium. It was a world of cool grays and muted golds, of polished chrome and projected skies that never rained. Here, plunging into the station's gut, that symphony devolved into a cacophony of failure. The groaning of the lift cables was punctuated by the rhythmic, heavy thump, thump, thump of a failing pump somewhere in the shaft wall. Condensation, thick and oily, beaded on the grimy panels and traced slow paths through decades of filth. Through the mesh of the cage, she saw the station's true architecture for the first time, not as a seamless habitat, but as a rotting leviathan. Massive, skeletal girders, once gilded, were now leprous, with patches of pale bioluminescent fungi that cast an eerie turquoise glow into the abyss. They pulsed softly, like sickly, sleeping lungs. Below, a web of maintenance conduits sparked erratically, brief, violent flashes of blue-white light that illuminated the sheer, terrifying depth of the chasm.
Then came the smell. It seeped through the floor grates first, a foul tide rising to meet her. The sterile ozone and faint clinical tang of formaldehyde that permeated the ossuary levels were familiar, controlled. This was different. This was the smell of uncontrolled life and unchecked death tangled together. The cloying sweetness of decay was here, but it was thicker, heavier, married to the humid stench of hydroponic rot from the rust gardens. It carried notes of algae, of stagnant water, of hot metal and unscrubbed human sweat. It was the scent of chaos, an organic aerosol of everything the architect's ideology sought to purify and transcend. The sparrow's jaw tightened. A knot of something cold and hard formed in her stomach. It wasn't fear. Fear was a disorderly emotion, a product of an unharmonized mind. This was revulsion, a profound systemic rejection of her surroundings. Every drip of water, every flicker of failing light, every molecule of putrid air was a personal offense against the order she embodied. The dregs who lived down here, she thought, were not just poor, they were contaminated. They swam in this filth, breathed it, became it. Echo lost, every one of them, their memories as fragmented and corroded as the walkways they trod. Her focus narrowed again to the datapad. The blinking green dot. Thorn. He was down here. By choice. What could a man like him, a man of science and intellect, possibly seek in this cesspool? The official report called resonance a system glitch, a cascade of corrupted data in the cryo-storage archives, a problem to be managed, contained, and erased. But Thorn wasn't managing. He was chasing. He was digging into the glitch, treating it not as an error, but as a source. This was the greater corruption. To seek meaning in chaos was the first step toward madness. A sudden, violent shudder rocked the lift, throwing her against the cage wall. The impact sent a jolt up her arm. An alarm blared, a discordant shriek that was immediately cut short with a shower of sparks from a ceiling panel. The emergency lights died, plunging her into absolute darkness, save for the cool green glow of her datapad and the sickly pulse of the fungi outside. The groaning of the lift deepened, the descent slowing to a painful, grinding crawl. Her breath caught, just for a second. She steadied herself, pushing off the wall, her movements economical and precise.
She did not allow the spike of adrenaline to bloom into panic. She cataloged the situation. Lift failing, primary power out, emergency systems compromised. The mission parameters, however, remained unchanged. Find Thorn. Neutralize the anomaly. From the darkness of the shaft below, a new sound drifted up. Faint, unstructured. It was a voice, but not a voice. A long, drawn-out syllable that echoed and distorted, as if filtered through water and static. A resonance echo. Louder and clearer than any she had heard on the upper levels. It wasn't a recording. It felt present. The sound scraped against the inside of her skull, a whisper of static that her neural implant tried and failed to filter. Her training dictated she ignore it, classify it as anomalous sensor data, but for a chilling instant it felt like a greeting from the abyss she was descending into. The lift gave one final deafening screech of tortured metal and slammed to a halt. The jolt nearly knocked the data pad from her grasp. For a moment, there was only the sound of her own controlled breathing and the slow, thick drip of condensation somewhere nearby. Then, with the grinding sound of stone on rust, the cage doors began to retract. Light, such as it was, spilled in. Not the clean, engineered light of her world, but a hazy, humid gloom from flickering neon signs and open braziers. The full, unmitigated stench of the lower market washed over her, a physical blow. The air was thick enough to taste, rot and rust and damp earth and cooked protein of questionable origin. She stood on the threshold, a figure carved from ice at the mouth of a sewer. The market was a sprawling cavern of makeshift stalls and huddled masses. Faces, pale and grimy, turned toward the lift, toward her. Their eyes, wide in the gloom, held a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and a deep, weary hunger. They were the dregs, the chaos, given human form. Her data pad chimed softly, a single pure note in the din. The green dot had stopped blinking. It was a solid, unwavering circle. Target acquired. Proximity, 20 meters. Vesper's expression was a mask of placid neutrality, her inner revulsion locked away behind years of discipline. He was here, in the heart of the decay. She holstered the datapad at her hip, the magnetic lock clicking into place with a sound of crisp finality. She took a breath, the foul air a necessary poison. Then she stepped out of the lift. Her polished black boots made no sound on the grimy, wet plating. She was a scalpel descending into a festering wound. The stillness will be restored.